You see this man? He knows a lot about swords, but on that day, clearly, he did not have any poise. I mean, he wasn't wearing armor, not seeing a wolf ring on him either, hence no poise. What? I already made that lame yet poignant pun in the title. Did you expect me to take another stab at it? That would be pointless. Alright, enough of that. So, Matt Easton put up a video recently that I disagree with.
Actually...
Not in an internet beef sort of way, so you drama junkies can wander off back into the wasteland of Twitter. This is something that I find worthwhile discussing. So what Matt drew our attention to is a potential explanation for why sword blades were made without pronounced tips. What he said here, I do agree with.
The reason that some swords have rounded, squared or hatchet tips is because those swords are fundamentally designed primarily for cutting.
Even though I think it's fair to say that in history the majority of swords all over the globe had some form of sharp pointed tip, obviously some didn't. Some terminated in a rounded spatulated tip, some were chopped off straight, some were something in between, a rudimentary point, if you will. So we can ask ourselves, why would you do that? Why would you take away a perfectly viable form of attack altogether? Because thrusts are very useful in combat. Why would you do that? The problem with speculating about historical designs is generally, well, we can't ask them. They've been long dead, whoever came up with this. And I have a pretty strong suspicion that even if we asked the owners and users of such swords back then, we would get different answers, different interpretations and explanations. Because that's just how humans are. We can't agree on anything, and sometimes we just make stuff up. Not saying that Matt made anything up, by the way. What he said makes sense when you hear it.
The bigger and more blunt the end is, the further up the blade or lever the center of percussion gets.
He's definitely not wrong in saying that. But at the same time, the sword that he's holding right there is sort of silently refuting the claim that he makes. It's really hard to avoid poignant puns for this one. If with this Takouba, the purpose was to bring the center of percussion up the blade, they would have screwed it up by giving it a profile taper. Why would you do that? If you want the center of percussion to be further up and thereby the sword blade to impact harder, you would not give it a profile taper. If we think about it, what are the only two reasons to go for a profile taper in a blade? One, to make it a better thruster, and two, to bring the balance further back, to make it more agile, give you more tip control, etc. That's the exact opposite of making it a harder hitting sword with the mass further up the blade. If you want to distribute the mass of a sword blade in a certain way, there are a number of options. One, of course, is more or less mass in the hilt. If you have something like this, a fairly small guard, small pommel, you're not going to have as much mass in the hilt, whereas something like this, of course, adds some with the knuckle guard. But mainly you do it with the thickness and the width of the blade. So one way is to simply make the blade wider. Such a wide blade, of course, is a pretty stout cutter. In this case, the point also is shaped accordingly. Where you have this clip point here that tapers it enough to allow for effective thrusts, but it's still reasonably wide here. It does not become extremely narrow. So you can still cut reasonably well up here. But generally, as Matt points out, the drawback of tapering a sword a lot and making it better for thrusting is the final section here of the blade is not going to be good at cutting. Think of it this way, the more you improve thrusting efficiency by tapering the point, the more you reduce your effective reach for cutting by shifting the center of percussion or sweet spot toward the hilt, which means for optimum impact force, that sounds so nerdy, you have to cut lower on the blade. So there's definitely some min-maxing going on, if you will. If you want to optimize the thrusting ability of a blade, you're going to reduce the maximum cutting performance and vice versa. There are ways to compromise, of course. You have plenty of cut and thrust swords that are pretty good at either, but the tip shape really doesn't make that much of a difference. Here's what Matt said about a particular saber.
Overall, that is a terrible shaped tip for penetrating clothing or anything else really.
A lot of katana tips are more or less like this. Some are more drawn out, but many of them have an angle such that if you were to make it completely round, it wouldn't even make that much of a difference. If you cut off this tip and rounded everything off, how much difference in weight would that make? A couple of grams, right? How much would that change the point of balance? I don't know, a millimeter? I really don't think you would even feel the difference in practical terms. If, however, you change the profile of that Takouba that Matt was holding in the video and made it with parallel edges rather than with a profile taper, I think that would make quite a bit of a difference for the balance. Also, you can do plenty with the distal taper of a sword blade. If instead of making it thin out toward the point, you leave it uniform, that's going to shift the center of percussion forward quite dramatically. And you can also change the dynamics of the blade if you give it a reinforced tip, because of course that adds mass as well, and at the same time it reduces the risk of damage to the end, which segues into the next point observation I want to make, namely material constraints. Depending on what sort of material you have to work with, say iron or lower quality steel or what have you, you may risk straight up breaking the tip off. Depending on the material, something like this might be awfully prone to be damaged. So in that case, you might want to back off a little bit and leave it wider, perhaps thicker too, maybe round it off a little bit so you don't risk losing that tip. And in fact, if you do, you might as well repair it by rounding off what's left and keep using it. So in some cases, swords that we find may not be the original shape anymore. They might have been repaired and reshaped and still used. In fact, with some Viking swords and other early medieval swords, it can be difficult to say what the original tip shape was because they just aren't preserved that well. Plenty of them are well enough preserved that we can tell, yes, this was indeed designed with a sharp tip. We can't really make broad, sweeping, generalized statements like, well, in Viking warfare, you didn't need to thrust, you would mainly slash because you wouldn't want to get the blade stuck in an opponent's shield, which is more likely with a cut than with a thrust. But either way, if you say, well, they just didn't use thrusts, why did some of them have sharp tips and others didn't? Personal preference? Material considerations? Who knows? Of course, this can be a way to straight up commit to the primary purpose of a blade. This is where I agree with Matt. Some blades just aren't really intended for thrusting. Now, a lot of machetes don't have pronounced points. Some really have none because they were intended for chopping. Mostly on underbrush and various other things in tool use rather than fighting against another armed human, even though obviously that happened as well. So if you don't really expect to need thrusts, then you might as well skip the point or make it such that it is usable, but the main emphasis is on durability. And the final point remark I want to leave you with is don't underestimate how well rounded tips can still thrust. I mean, sure, against something like sturdy padded armor, a gambeson, yeah, this would be difficult. Regular clothing, I'm convinced this would definitely penetrate. Because let's not forget how much force is behind a thrust. it still concentrates it on a smaller surface, particularly if you have profile taper, and it's still sharp. So yeah, I'm convinced that this would thrust just fine. Not as well as something like this, obviously, but well enough to be perfectly usable. I would love to test this on a torso analog from Ballistic Dummy Labs, but I'm not made of money, so that's not likely. Speaking of which, I have a Patreon, which helps me make better videos and gives you some extra stuff, like a Discord server. I know, nobody likes paywalls, but it's worth it. A paywalled community is a polite community, and you also get occasional bonus content. Just saying. Anecdotally, I've heard of at least one case where in HEMA sparring a blade broke and pierced the fencing jacket. You get the point. Idea. I really need to stop this. And stop it I shall. I think that's enough rambling for one video. As said, this is not a personal attack on Matt. He clearly knows his stuff. It's just something I disagree with. And feel free to discuss in the comments. Let us know your opinions without stabbing each other verbally. Let's have a civil discussion. And even though this all boils down to essentially an actually video, I hope you found it interesting, entertaining perhaps. Thanks for watching and have a good one, folks.